Only 3 Nintendo consoles have never been graced with the presence of their very own mainline Fire Emblem game. There's the Game Boy, which probably simply couldn't handle the complexity of even early Fire Emblem games, the Wii U, which was such a big success it didn't need it, and the Nintendo 64, which has always felt like the odd one out in this group. While Mario, Zelda, Kirby and more made the jump to 3D, Fire Emblem stayed behind. Literally. Because even after the Nintendo 64 was already revealed, shipped, released and even kinda old, Firacia 776 came to the Super Famicom, or SNES, like it was still booming. But it wasn't always meant to be this way. Fire Emblem 64 did at one point exist, and was in development for a not insignificant amount of time. While the game itself never saw the light of day, information about it has since come to the surface, some of it even from official sources, allowing us to take a deeper look at Fire Emblem 64, the game that never was. It's a story that starts all the way back in 1996, the year the Nintendo 64 released. Japan received the console in June, a mere month after Genealogy of the Holy War was released on Super Famicom. As such, while Nintendo's in-house studios were busy working on titles like Super Mario 64 ever since the console was first released in 1994, Intelligent Systems had spent that entire time working on a game for the Super Famicom instead. But when series director and creator Shuzo Kaga was asked whether focus was now being shifted to Nintendo's new shiny device, he dodged the question. Although it's not been decided yet, if there is a next game, the level of strategy would be much higher, and I would also return to something that's easier to play, he explained in a guidebook for Genealogy of the Holy War. I don't want to lose what makes Fire Emblem stand out from other games. As for the story, I'd like to explore Arcania's world again, from before the start of Marth's adventures when he landed on Talise. Although enemies, I want to develop the stories of interesting characters like Camus and Michaelis. While Kaga is far from promising a Fire Emblem for Nintendo 64 here, the game he outlines at the end there would end up happening. Released in 1997, Fire Emblem Arcania Saga was a Super Famicom game playable using the Satellaview program, a sort of satellite radio streaming service, and dives into the stories of Arcania before the start of Shadow Dragon. These chapters would later be included in New Mystery of the Emblem as well, so if you're curious what they're like, you can now experience them in a relatively modern setting. The first part of Kaga's answer seems to indicate the core ideas for Firacia 776 were also already present in his head, as that game was definitely at the time one of the hardest Fire Emblem games, yet also pretty straightforward in its presentation and structure. But what console would it be coming to? Surely it would be the Nintendo 64, right? Well, not only do we know the answer in hindsight, Kaga didn't exactly hide his intentions either. I think being on the Super Famicom will be fine. If it were on the Nintendo 64, the battle scenes would use polygons and I'd have more to say, he said during an interview in October 1996. Now, if you take this comment at face value, it would almost seem like there is no Fire Emblem 64. The series director outright says the Super Famicom will do nicely, and no plans for an entry on Nintendo 64 were as much as hinted at by Intelligent Systems. But that would all change in 1997. Shigeru Miyamoto, Nintendo's big man himself, announced that Fire Emblem 64 was in the works in an interview with Dengeki. He even mentions a possible release window for the game, being the latter half of 1998, after the release of Super Mario RPG 2, a title that would eventually become Paper Mario. As you may or may not know, the Paper Mario series has also been developed by Intelligent Systems since the dawn of the series on Nintendo 64. What is very noteworthy here though, is that Miyamoto basically confirms Paper Mario will release in early 1998, and let's just say he was quite off there. Unlike Fire Emblem 64, Paper Mario did release, but it wasn't until 2000 that it finally came out, becoming one of the last Nintendo published titles for the N64. How exactly that ties into Fire Emblem 64 is hard to say, but it does show things at Intelligent Systems weren't progressing as was apparently once planned. A year after Miyamoto's soft announcement, Fire Emblem 64 was officially revealed in an entry of 64 Dream magazine. This announcement barely contained any details, but it was revealed the game would be released as a Nintendo 64 DD disc. The Nintendo 64 DD was an add-on for the regular console that allowed games to be released as discs, thus allowing for much more memory and power than the cartridges Nintendo still used. It was a clear answer to the PlayStation, which was a huge success with both fans and developers exactly because it used more powerful CDs, but unlike Sony's first console, the N64DD flopped hard. Only 9 games were ever released for it, but more were planned. Ura Zelda, an expansion for Ocarina of Time, is a famous one, but it seems this is the category that we should also put Fire Emblem 64 into. With the cancellation of the 64DD, development of Fire Emblem 64 was presumably shifted back to the regular console, but that wasn't exactly going as planned is definitely strongly suggested by Shuzo Kaga in an interview in January 1999, at which point the game was supposed to be out already. After Genealogy of the Holy War was completed, the theme of the next game was considered immediately. In fact, we had originally wanted to return to Arcania, the stage of Mystery of the Emblem. However, although we intended to go in this direction from the very beginning, during the preliminary preparations we realized it was too ambitious and difficult to do with the Super Famicom hardware. If possible, we'd like to do it for new hardware. So, as it turns out, Arcania Saga has not yet scratched Kaga's Arcania itch. In fact, it seems more likely that game was what remains from the high ambitions he was unable to reach. One big question remains regarding this quote, however. This system lacking in power that Kaga refers to. Is it the Super Famicom, which Arcania Saga was developed for? Or is it the Nintendo 64, which was definitely the current hardware of 1999? We don't have a confirmed answer to this quite important question, with the few sources we have not being in agreement, but I personally think a lot can be deduced from what happened in the rest of the year. Phrasia 776 released for the Super Famicom, showing that wasn't a console IS were done with, and just before it hit store shelves, Kaga left Intelligent Systems to start his own company and make games for the PlayStation. You know, that console that could make more powerful games because it had a disk drive. And to strengthen that connection even further, Kaga initially planned to release a game set in Arcania that featured elements from Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light on the PlayStation, just like he mentioned he was unable to do on Nintendo hardware. Eventually, Nintendo shut down these plans and sued him, resulting in what was supposed to be Emblem Saga being retitled to Tearing Saga to avoid further problems with the Big N. Intelligent Systems, now Kaga-less, were forced to move on, with the replacements for the Nintendo 64 already lined up. Nintendo would release both the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube in the early 2000s, with the first Fire Emblem game for the two systems being revealed as Fire Emblem Ankoku no Miku, which means Maiden or Priestess of Darkness, slated to release on GBA in 2001. The same statement also confirmed Fire Emblem 64 had been cancelled due to hardware issues, with development now shifting to Maiden of Darkness. In mid-2001, Maiden of Darkness was renamed to The Binding Blade, and eventually came out a year later on GBA. To what extent the Binding Blade resembled what Kaga originally planned for Fire Emblem 64 was a complete mystery at the time, but today we know there is certainly some overlap between the projects, and even Fire Emblem games that wouldn't be released for years. The Making of Fire Emblem 25th Anniversary Development Secrets Awakening and Fates was an anniversary book released in 2015 that detailed, well, what it says on the tin, development secrets from the Fire Emblem series, mostly focusing on Awakening and Fates, but also, to everyone's surprise, revealing new information and even images from Fire Emblem 64. The most striking by far is this one, the only screenshot we have ever received from Fire Emblem 64. It shows the game had a portrait style that I would describe as a mix between Genealogy of the Holy War and Path of Radiance, while the style of the game itself, as visible behind the characters, reminds me more of an HD 2D look as is more common today. It definitely isn't completely 3D like Path of Radiance is, but it's also not entirely flat like the GBA games. The text in this screenshot reads, "Bows are my specialty, because I always go hunting in the mountains," as said by the girl on the right. It reveals she was most likely an archer, and thanks to the script to this scene being included in the book, we also know her name was Rei. And that is noteworthy, because that name would end up being used in Binding Blade for Rei, albeit spelled differently and now referring to a male character, interestingly enough. And trust me, the name parallels don't end there. The male character Rei is talking to is referred to as Ephraim, as in one of the main lords from Sacred Stones, a role he actually may have served in this game as well, as far as we can tell from the few lines of script we have to work with. Other names that appear in this scene are that of Ephraim's loyal knight, Bors, who appears in the same role on Binding Blade, Aaron, a name that has never reappeared, Ephraim's father, Eliwood, who would end up becoming Roy's father, obviously, and Owain. Now, that is the same name as Alyssa's son in Awakening, but the origins of this name actually don't come from Fire Emblem 64, as the Japanese spelling of the name was different. Design-wise, I don't immediately see what happened to the looks of this duo, although Ray does resemble Cav somewhat, and Ephraim's portrait may have been turned into either Klein or Pent over time, but that is complete speculation on my part. But while this was the only screenshot included in the book, there were several more character sketches included as well. This was once the main lord of Fire Emblem 64, a young man known as Ike. Yeah, that's another name that found its way into the series after all. Design-wise, this art reminds me of a mix of Roy and Leaf, but when looking at more concept art of Roy, it becomes clear how he morphs into the character we have come to know over time. This mysterious woman is called Edun, a name that would end up reused for the main villain of Binding Blade. Looking at this design, I can't imagine she was supposed to be the villain in this game as well, but hey, don't judge a book by its cover. This character, with a variety of hairstyles, is referred to as Tacky, one of the few names from these sketches that didn't end up reused. His design is a little reminiscent of Sin, although we never see him without his bandana, so it's hard to say. This purple-haired lady, Lynette, was also not lost to the sands of time. While her name is one you might not recognize, she did actually return in Berwick Saga, Kaga's second game after his move to PlayStation. The design definitely wasn't lifted over though. More concept art depicts a character known as Helen, who may have seen her name transfer over to Helene, the Queen of Bern and mother of Zephiel. 3 more pieces of artwork don't have any names mentioned, but do show characters that were at one point planned to appear in Fire Emblem 64. We have a girl with light blue hair, reminiscent of Ninian if you ask me, another more angry looking woman with red hair, and this strong man that isn't even colored in. This is all the art book reveals on Fire Emblem 64 and what it was supposed to look like, but there is one more detail known about the game that was revealed in an interview for the Binding Blade. It tells us Roy, the main lord of the game as earlier established, was not the only character to be directly lifted from Fire Emblem 64, the Maiden of Darkness, to the Binding Blade. Carol also survived the shift, with the Sword Master apparently created for Fire Emblem 64 and then lifted over without significant rewrites. And with that, the story of Fire Emblem 64 comes to an end. This is all we currently know about the game, and seeing as 0 demos, footage or other builds of the game have ever appeared online or have been included in any of the major leaks that have happened at Nintendo in recent years, it feels likely we may never know more about the game than we do now. I hope I'm wrong on that account, but I can't say I'm optimistic. But what do you think? Will we ever learn more about this game? And what are your thoughts on the creation and cancellation of Fire Emblem 64? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.